presentation on. Share screen. Right, so hopefully you can see my screen. Actually, if I move that over there. Okay, so great. All right, so this is a bit of a sort of general sort of discussion about sort of consent mode and just some slides that I threw together quickly. I used to be part of Accelerate, and now I've sort of split off into my own agency called MeasureMinds. So we're sort of based in Bristol, just near to London, doing sort of pure play analytics, Google Tag Manager, and it's a day studio. For a large number of international and enterprise sites. We are obviously, we're looking for sort of new candidates at the moment. So if you're a senior implementation specialist, insight specialist, or CRO expert, please reach out to me. We've got a crazy amount of funding at the moment, so just ping me a message if that's you. In terms of what I'm going to just go through in here. So this is my experience of using GTM's consent mode, some sort of lessons learned, and hopefully a few useful sort of takeaways for you if you're sort of trying to use it at the moment. That's a rough kind of agenda, so I'm just going to walk through each of these kind of bits. My experience with this has mainly been on either using CookieBot, OneTrust, or a sort of custom consent banner, which was originally it was the Silk-Tide one that's got made open source. So I'll just sort of share my experience of that. Just kind of before we sort of dive into GTM's consent mode, I want to just explain the sort of the legacy or the previous way of doing that, just for background. So normally the method I would use would be setting Google Analytics to on by default, although changing the remarketing or allow ad features to off by default. But I would allow users to opt out by using, in effect, a blocking rule, which meant that they could, if they clicked opt out on the privacy policy page, or within a banner, then it would store a cookie, and thus Google Tag Manager would check for the existence of that cookie or data layer value, and it would then stop firing the analytics pixel if that was detected. So the reason I used a blocking rule was just that's more robust because there could be events or like on-click events as well as on-load events, and that blocking rule was marked on all events and just whether it detected that sort of status of opt-out. So that method worked, and there was also a separate blocking rule for remarketing tags. So in this case, you can see there's a Facebook tag here, which is using the same sort of method, a blocking rule, and this one's firing on all pages, or if they click the banner link to allow cookies. Obviously, Facebook was off by default because it's used for remarketing and retargeting, so necessary or more risky to have that on, so hence off by default. The remarketing one just looks like this. So obviously the blocking rules down here with that exception for allow remarketing, and that would meant that they would only get remarketed to, or that Facebook tag would only ever invoke if they've either accepted the cookie box, the banner. It would not be on by default. You can check out how that setup looked. That's in one of my sort of templates here. So that was the sort of the old way of doing it, which is in that GDPR sort of template from the past. Obviously now Google has introduced a new way of doing this, and in essence those blocking rule methods have been superseded by GTM's new consent mode. There's a better or new way to do this. So I haven't got a template for the new consent mode yet, but I will update it in this list once I've sort of saved it. And also the two main types, which are either analytics cookies or remarketing cookies, have been expanded into 5 new types. So you might have, when previously if you've been doing kind of GTM setups or sort of cookie audits, you're probably familiar with analytics, remarketing, and functional cookies. Functional ones are normally things like live chat or language selection or sort of a video sort of loudness. So Google being Google, they thought, I know, how can we make this even more complex than it is? I know, let's have 5 different types just because we can. So there's now 5 different types of category when previously there were 4. So where previously we had remarketing, analytics, and functional, there's now these new ones for personalization and security storage. Personalization, that would be if you're using, let's say, Google Optimize, and you're using some of the cookies or functionality within that to change an A/B testing experience based off what you know about a particular person. The security storage, that could be things like ad frequency capping or Google reCAPTCHA. So generally that's going to fall into the sort of necessary category. When I've been doing this with CookieBot automatically maps security storage into a necessary category, and it changes personalization storage into analytics. But that's just CookieBot's kind of logic for doing that. So thanks, Google, for making it even more complex. Cheers. I don't know, I've got another picture of dogs and cats on here. No idea. Anyways, so you're probably thinking, well, that's okay. Well, I can use this new kind of data layer for consent and build the logic around these new 5 different categories for security, functionality, ad storage, personalization, etc., etc. Obviously, I need to be careful and make sure that these I'm using the word denied or allowed on here, not true or false. And I should be able to push that to the data layer and monitor the output of it, shouldn't I, in theory? That's how it should work. But again, Google being Google, they decided, let's not use a standard data layer. Let's kind of use a slightly different one. So in this instance here, instead of doing this, they actually use arguments which are actually sent in using the G tag. So this method here doesn't work. You actually have to send in the defaults using this method, which is G tag, and that then gets converted into a data layer output. And you can see that G tag running here, and then the data layer function above it, which in effect reads that G tag value. The reason I mention this is if you're trying to kind of view the output of this sort of new sort of consent mode, you have to use a little bit of a workaround to access those values as data layer values, just to help with your QA testing process and validation. What you actually have to do is, because these are, you can't use the standard data layer to read these values, because they're actually they're set as arguments. So instead, you have to read the last value in the data layer and then extract in this case, analytics storage. So it is possible to read those values using a little bit of a sort of fiddly workaround. And just looping through the last values of the data layer and getting, in this case, analytics storage, or it could be allow ad storage. That will give you that that denied or granted value. And then you can use that for testing and validating. In here, where I was sort of checking the Google consent mode versus that blocking rule method, I could use this to do that. So on that kind of testing sort of mode, I created these bunch of new variables using this similar method, just to sort of double check and validate the output of those values, because obviously, because we're dealing with compliance here, I don't want to risk rolling out a change and then accidentally having remarketing on by default. That would be a huge kind of headache. So hence this method was allowed me just to validate these outputs and grab them and push them into the console window and double check that stuff is working as expected. So in here, this one here, as I said, I was kind of going through that double checking process, and I just converted where previously I had a blocking rule for, let's say, rejected analytics. I changed that over to read the new GTM consent mode method, in this case, analytics storage, which was looking at that granted or denied. This method worked, but there are a few nuances that I noticed when I was sort of doing this. So I'm just going to go into those sort of known issues, and I'm telling you this so that you're aware of it and it doesn't sort of catch you out. So bear in mind that GTM consent mode is pretty new, so there is likely to be kind of issues. But we'll start with the kind of obvious kind of gotchas. So GTM consent mode with the most of the Google tags, Google actually picks the category that they fall into. So you don't actually have any control over that. So that's fine if you're using, let's say, the AdWords remarketing tag where it's obvious. But in areas where it gets a bit gray, such as the AdWords conversion pixel, it's a bit of a pain because in this case, you might say, well, hold on, the AdWords conversion pixel, that's actually used to remove people from a remarketing list. So it actually probably should be better to treat that as analytics storage rather than ad storage, because in effect, we don't want to remarket to people that have already purchased the product, and that's good for users because they don't see these remarketing banners as well. So Google has unfortunately kind of forced the hand there and said, I'm just going to treat all AdWords conversion pixels as ad storage, and there's no way to override that, which is really, really annoying. I say there's no way to override it. There is a workaround, which would be, instead of using an AdWords template tag, you can use an AdWords custom HTML tag, and then you can set the built-in storage to anything that you want. But that does seem a bit of a sort of a backward step, really, because obviously trying to move away from template tags is the sort of aim here. So it's unfortunate that they've kind of set that, and obviously this is in a beta mode, so that's kind of potential sort of feedback. Another thing just to be aware of is with ad storage with the Google Analytics Pixel and also G4, that also has ad storage automatically applied on it. That may not always be the case though. For example, if you turn off allow ad features, then potentially there is no ad storage on that Google Analytics Pixel, and you can do the same with GA4. So in this case, technically it shouldn't be ad storage, but again, there's no way to override that setting, which again is not ideal. They have, however, Google has half got it right on the call tracking. So instead of putting call tracking in as an ad storage, they've actually left the default empty on that. So that one you can sort of put into either performance sort of tags or into remarketing. And I think my personal preference would be if they did the same on the AdWords conversion, just so then the users can decide if they want to be white as white or slightly grey. The other one was okay, hold on, just give me 0.25 seconds. Right, sorry about that. So why did I do that? Well, it's because you need to wait for an update. As part of Google consent mode is Google's kind of saying, I'm going to try and capture some stuff about you straight away, but I'm going to give you a chance to kind of for the banner to load and for you to answer whether you accept or deny, let's say, analytics pixels. So that's why they've got this wait for update. However, it does mean there's going to be a slight loss in tracking because of that, but we need to kind of give the users enough time to be able to answer that question and for the banner to render. The reason why Google have done the wait for update, not just for to allow the banner to load, is also because there will be a new feature at some point in time which will capture like an anonymous tracking pixel, let's say with browser and with a device signature, let's say, and without any IP address and without any cookies. So a cookieless tracking pixel, which fires for all users, regardless if they've accepted or not. And then after they then see the banner and press accept, then that's obviously it's got that data. If they then deny, Google in theory can then do upscaling for those people that have opted out, so that there's ways of doing a widening on page views or conversions. Similar sort of thing to what Google does with clicks to store, where they use the data from Android to estimate how many people have clicked to store from Safari or Apple devices. So with that in mind, you're probably wondering, why on earth have I got a picture of a cup of tea in front of me and on the screen? Well, it's because there is no spoon. So what on earth am I going on about here? Well, it's because that anonymous tracking pixel doesn't yet do anything. So this kind of quote here, so that pixel which potentially is sent before any accept is granted and before any cookies are set, that is a potential feature in the future, but as it stands at the moment, there's no way in Google Analytics to run a report on what are the number of kind of all users, regardless of whether they've opted in or out, just using basic analytics or anonymized analytics pixels. But maybe it will, Google hopefully will introduce that feature later down the line. So there's no spoon yet, but there might be in the future. One other kind of thing just to be aware of, and this is a cookie bot specific thing, is that as part of GTM consent mode, it recommends, instead of using all pages rule, use the page initialized rule, which is called GTM.initialize as an event. That doesn't actually work when using cookie bot. You have to instead use the cookie bot consent updated. It's a minor thing, but it will catch you out if you don't change it to that mode. So that's what I normally do, is I, in effect, create an event called initialization all pages and then set that to cookie consent updated. It's just because there's a slight latency when CookieBot checks for the values of cookies and checks for the sort of consent status. CookieBot itself, they've updated their sort of GTM template recently, which is great. So they now give you the ability to set your default. So you can choose whether you want analytics on by default or not within this list. However, they don't have the setting for wait, let's say 0.5 seconds for tags. However, you can get around that by adding a sort of tag dependency that runs after CookieBot fires, and then just add that GTM initialized to as a possible kind of way around that, if you do want to sort of get around that. Or hopefully maybe they'll update the template to include wait for tags instead. It's a little bit tricky for me to sort of read the questions while sort of presenting this, so I'm going to cover those at the end. Loop back around with questions. Now there's kind of in effect at the moment two ways of adding or classifying tags on a website. You've got automatic or manual. So CookieBot and OneTrust are the two sort of vendors that support automatic classifications. Personally, I prefer like manual classifications, mainly because of the impact on speed. When you run an automatic classification script such as AutoBlock from OneTrust or a similar one from CookieBot, it basically inspects all of the JavaScript on the site. Well, actually, it crawls all of the cookies and JavaScript on the site, and then it in effect puts those into those three classifications, and it attaches either a class or an HTML5 attribute stating which classification it's put it into. Now that obviously takes quite a lot of kind of DOM time to attach that classification, and also it has to run in synchronous mode rather than async. So not great, given that Google is rolling out a sort of an update for site speed and rendering time. So personally, I always try and go down the manual route, but in some instances that's not possible, especially if OneTrust or CookieBot are installed outside of GTM, or if it's a large site and they just want to be like whiter than white and have no risk of any tags falling outside of compliance. So that's and that's why I've sort of listed that on here in terms of that chance of sort of breach, because in effect AutoBlock will do that classifications without a user going in and intervening. It's also possible that a user could put a tag in the wrong category within GTM, so that's also another sort of risk kind of factor. Yeah, I mean, it's good that Google has at least tried to add some of those default classifications within consent mode, but yeah, there are some instances where it's kind of got it either a bit wrong or is only going for a whiter than white approach rather than sort of something in the middle. When using those automatic blocking methods, so in this case, I'm just showing Cookiebot on the screen, because these codes are sort of synchronous and because they need to in effect run before any tags are fired in order to prevent remarketing or analytics triggering, they generally need to be sort of synchronous. And also, when using these modes, it's really important that you mark the GTM tag itself as an ignore or as a one trust, call it like category one for strictly necessary, or a one trust opt out for script. The reason for that is then it doesn't slow down GTM when GTM is loading, but the elements within GTM, so the analytics.javascript and those other tags, do get classified. So when I tried running testing, when these kind of opt-out values were not present on OneTrust, it actually resulted in about a 3% drop in reported traffic. So if you are using auto block on OneTrust or Cookiebot, super important that you add the opt-out to the gtm.javascript script, otherwise you'll miss a massive chunk. If you're not using auto block, then it's less of a problem, that you don't need to worry as much about these HTML5 attributes and the auto block here. And also you get the additional benefit that you can load the cookie banner asynchronously, as you can see on this screen here. So you don't necessarily need to worry about a WordPress plugin if you are using that manual classification. But if you're using automatic, you have to update the inline code and do it outside of GTM, which is a slight sort of technical difficulty in some cases. The other thing is more of a kind of an industry shift that I'm seeing. So previously, I would say that the floating footers are probably the most common. Now, apologies for the crude jokes coming up. I'm just warning you in advance. So yeah, I know we are talking about floating footers here. Sorry, that's the wrong slide. What I mean by a floating footer is that it's a box that slides up from the bottom, and it's normally it's not obtrusive. It's not stopping the user kind of being able to navigate the site, and it's generally just used for an opt-in for remarketing. Normally, in these cases with a floating footer, analytics would be on by default. Now, previously, I would say that floating footers were more common, but there's been a shift more towards sort of modal pop-ups or cookie walls. The reason for this is obviously cookie walls. Users are getting more familiar with just as soon as they see a cookie wall, they just close the box or accept all, and that's seen in these kind of opt-in rates. So this is probably kind of the much more obvious and common route now, and also it keeps the compliance officer happy because in effect the analytics cookie here is also kind of opted into as in this case, statistics is pre-ticked and the remarketing is unticked. Again, that's a slightly grey area with compliance, but because we're only talking about remarketing is separated out from statistics, I would argue that that's kind of valid. And the other method here is the fact that because the users have to accept cookies in order to use the site, then there's no real choice here, really. So until at some point when the browsers introduce a consent API, and then it will be a lot simpler and we won't have all this kind of horrible UI issues. Examples of what the consent API might look like would be things such as on here, this has got an HTML5, a geolocation kind of pop up, or a push notification pop up. So in essence, the browser would take control of the sort of consent, and then you wouldn't need to worry about an injected kind of banner. So there's not there's nothing in sort of WebKit for this at the moment. It's not publicly sort of available, and it will probably be a gradual sort of switch to this. But that's kind of also why GTM and GTM consent mode have focused on the back end side and the logic and rules rather than the front end and the banner side, in the sense there's no GTM banner modal, because of the fact that even they realize that the browsers are going to kind of handle that bit at some point in the future. So it is still necessary to have both GTM doing the back end kind of consent mode and some sort of front end modal, which potentially could be switched to a browser-based solution later down the line when the browsers eventually support that. Just one other thing in terms of monitoring this, a useful sort of takeaway would be keep an eye on the difference between your clicks from AdWords versus your sessions. If that starts to drop kind of massively, then obviously you've got a problem with kind of opt-out rates. On this case, on this particular sort of slide, I am starting to see that increase in opt-out and there's a difference, which is a bigger problem, and another reason why a shift more towards server side, where it's harder to sort of opt out. Also, some of these cookie bot solutions will give you those kind of opt-in rates, which is helpful. Which potentially can be used for sort of estimating the amount that have been missed or missed conversions. So that's everything I want to sort of cover in the slides. So I'm now going to jump over to questions. Just seeing how we're doing for time. Oh, literally, I'm bang on. How do I stop sharing? So I'm just going to read through the questions. I can, if anyone wants to be put on stage, just click raise your hand. So reading from the top. Actually, there's a Q&A one here. Okay. Do you have a preference to fire the banner via GTM or hard-coded if you had the choice? If you didn't have to load into GTM, is there anything you should be mindful of? So personally, I always try and load the banner via GTM, because obviously I'm mindful that at some point in time the browsers are going to sort of take over that bit, and I want to make it easy for the clients to be able to switch over to a browser-based consent window when it becomes available. And I don't like them being locked into a specific kind of cookie vendor. And also the other reason would be I don't like when the banners are sometimes loaded synchronously, and obviously it slows down the rest of the site. So always via GTM where possible, and always via sort of synchronous code, asynchronous. I mean, the other questions. Yeah, why is GTM hasn't created a new variable type for consent? Yeah, it's bonkers that they haven't created defaults for it. Yeah, absolutely crazy. Google integration with GTM community has big problems when the user has accepted all types of cookies. There is some delay between the page start and the load. Yes. So that's correct. I mean, that's why instead of using the GTM initialized, you have to use the cookie bot updated, which is not ideal. So if you're configure for an example for GTM page view on load, you have to almost wait until the Alex storage is nice, even though to be granted. Yeah, I mean, if you wait for that event called cookie bot updated, that does get around that problem. Is anyone using this new solution, OneTrust? Not yet, but I've got one site that I'm going to start sort of playing with. I mean, because it's still in beta, everyone's sort of true, and no one really wants to be the sort of first ones to sort of try it out. So it's kind of, I've been sort of testing this on my own site at the moment and just ironing out all the bugs first before risking it on a client site. For instance, like CookieBot and OneTrust doesn't have a tag template at the moment, and there's nothing in the public library for it. So they need to kind of do that first, ideally. I'll try it next week. What's the difference between not set and no additional required? Good question. Not much. The only difference is in the listing of tags that you've not reviewed, it gets moved. So whenever you set something on up here, whenever you add it into an area, so let's say some custom code down here, this one here, so this one, the this one, not set and no additional. No additional just means that you've reviewed it. There's no change in the actual functionality, just it's where it appears on this kind of summary report. And I've been pushing our OneTrust rep for dates when they'll get templates. Oh yeah, it's on our roadmap. That'd be great. I see my comments about Keyboard it sucks. Okay, I don't expect. Right. Okay. Anyone have experience of migrating consent from Cookiebot to OneTrust? Use case for that is the website has been using Cookiebot for a while, and switching to OneTrust without having to ask them consent. So just be aware that, and then this is a good thing about using GTM's consent mode. In essence, by using that G tag update, Google is setting that storage themselves. So they're standardizing the cookie or local storage values. If you're using Cookiebot or OneTrust, those two solutions use different names for cookies. So if you do migrate between solutions, you might end up having to ask users for consent again. So there is a benefit in GTM consent mode in that sense. You can obviously copy cookies and so that you get synergy when doing any migration between Cookiebot and OneTrust or vice versa. So we're probably running out of time now. So we'll just see if there's any other further questions. Do you have a preference? Are there any problematic issues loading it through GTM in regards to race conditions? Yes, in the sense that obviously this wait for tag updates is there's and the issues are more about regarding if you need to make a decision whether you're using auto block or manual block, because if you're using auto block, then you've got to load the cookie banner outside of GTM. And it needs to load in synchronous mode, so that removes the race condition issues. But if you're using Cookiebot within GTM, you'd have to load it as a tag dependency for that wait for update or initialized kind of bit. Do you have any preference to the banner? Covered that one. For your clients, do you consider yourself data controller or a data protection? So this is Google's view is always kind of hand the buck over to the agency or the client to and it's worth noting that Google is also trying to move all of its US servers or allow for European data centers to sort of get around some of the issues with GDPR. Probably more likely data processor rather than data controller though. Do you have time values for consent, e.g. a time frame on the set notification? I mean, the default at the moment is 0.5 seconds. That's what everyone seems to be kind of using. But that's still going to be dependent on how fast. If someone's on a mobile connection, that may be not necessarily enough time. So it may be necessary to use conditional kind of sort of set timeouts depending on your speed of connection. It's still kind of in flux on that one because it's obviously still in beta. Okay, I'm going to end this session now.